A toy that is, at its core, nothing more than a length of ordinary coiled wire, has sold hundreds of millions of units worldwide, earned a permanent place in the National Toy Hall of Fame, and started life entirely by accident. Invented by a naval engineer who was not trying to build a toy at all, and did not initially believe he had built one until he watched the thing fall off his own desk. That engineer eventually walked away from the company, from the invention, and from his own family, disappearing to the other side of the world to join a religious group almost nobody outside it had ever heard of, leaving behind a business that was, at the time, close to failing entirely. What happened to the toy after that had almost nothing to do with him at all. This is the story of the Slinky, and of the person who actually built it into an American icon after the man whose name is still on the original patent was already gone from the picture for good. Richard Thompson James was born in 1918 and grew up with a genuinely mechanical mind from an early age, the kind of child who took things apart simply to understand how they worked rather than out of any particular mischief or destructive impulse, much to the occasional frustration of the adults around him who had to put those same objects back together or replace them entirely. His family fell on hard times during a sharp economic downturn in the early 1920s, well before the more famous crash later brought the entire country's economy down for the better part of a decade. And as a child, he took to making his own toys out of household scraps, springs among them, long before he had any formal training in engineering at all, or any reason to suspect that childhood instinct would someday become his entire professional career. At 13, he found an abandoned 1923 Buick sitting in the woods near his home, left there by whoever had owned it and apparently given up on it entirely, and repaired it well enough on his own, with no adult supervision or formal instruction of any kind, to get it running again, eventually selling it for a genuine profit, an early and genuinely striking demonstration of exactly the kind of hands-on mechanical instinct that would define the rest of his working life decades before anyone around him thought to call it engineering talent rather than simply an unusual hobby for a boy his age. He went on to earn a degree in mechanical engineering from Pennsylvania State University in 1939, formal academic training layered on top of instincts he had already been sharpening on his own since childhood, and from there joined naval engineering work in Philadelphia, eventually taking a position at the William Cramp & Son shipyard, one of the country's older and more established shipbuilding operations, a firm with its own long history of supplying vessels to the United States Navy stretching back well before either World War. His job there had nothing to do with toys of any kind, at least not at the outset of the assignment that would eventually, entirely by accident, produce one. In 1943, in the middle of the Second World War, James was assigned to develop tension springs meant to stabilize sensitive shipboard instruments, delicate equipment that could easily be thrown off by the constant vibration of a warship in active operation, shaking loose from the recoil of gunfire, from the propeller shafts turning below deck for hours at a stretch without pause, and from rough open ocean seas, pitching the entire vessel around in ways that could ruin a precision reading in an instant, and potentially compromise a ship's ability to accurately aim its own weapons. It was serious, unglamorous wartime engineering work, the kind that rarely made headlines, but genuinely mattered to how effectively a ship's crew could operate its own equipment under combat conditions. James spent long stretches testing spring after spring, by some accounts hundreds of different prototypes in total, each one varying slightly in wire thickness, coil spacing, and tension, keeping them stacked in a cluttered row across his own work desk as he worked through the underlying problem. One small variation at a time, the kind of patient, repetitive trial-and-error engineering work that rarely produces a dramatic breakthrough on any predictable schedule. One of those prototypes fell. Rather than simply bouncing once and coming to rest the way an ordinary dropped spring would, it tumbled end over end off the desk, down onto a stack of books nearby, and across the floor, coiling and uncoiling itself in a smooth, continuous, oddly graceful walking motion that had absolutely nothing to do with the vibration-dampening problem James had actually been paid by the Navy to solve. He noticed it immediately, the way a trained engineer notices the one result that does not fit the pattern he had been expecting all along after months of otherwise unremarkable testing. He went home that evening and told his wife, Betty, what he had seen, describing a spring that had somehow walked itself across a room rather than simply falling. And according to her own later recollection of the conversation, He said something close to this, that if he could just find the right properties of steel and the right amount of tension, he believed he could make a spring that would walk on its own, reliably, every single time. Over the following 2 years, working through the rest of the war and into peacetime largely on his own time, outside his actual job, James experimented with different types of steel wire, adjusting thickness and coil tension by hand, methodically chasing the exact combination of properties that had shown up seemingly by pure chance in that one prototype among the hundreds already sitting on his own desk. It is worth understanding exactly what makes that walking motion physically possible, because it is a genuinely elegant piece of applied physics hiding inside what looks, at a glance, like nothing more than an ordinary toy a child might get bored with in an afternoon. A properly tensioned coil spring, pre-compressed the way James eventually settled on through 2 years of trial and error, stores elastic potential energy along its entire length the moment it is stretched even slightly beyond its resting shape. Tip one end of the spring over the edge of a step, and gravity pulls that leading section downward, while the trailing coils, still held under tension by the spring's own internal structure, momentarily hold their position rather than collapsing all at once. That delay is the entire trick. The stored energy then releases in a traveling wave running the length of the spring, pulling each successive coil up and over the ones ahead of it in sequence, rather than the whole object simply falling as one rigid unit the way a solid rod or a stiff wire would. The spring effectively turns itself inside out, coil by coil, in a continuous rolling motion, converting the potential energy stored in its own tension directly into the forward end-over-end tumbling motion that carries it down one step and, critically, leaves it perfectly positioned at the bottom to immediately repeat the exact same sequence on the next step below, over and over, for as long as there are steps left to descend. James eventually settled on a specific design using roughly 80 feet of high-tension steel wire, wound into 98 tightly coiled loops standing about 2.5 inches tall once compressed together. The precise combination of wire length, coil count, and spring tension needed to make that self-perpetuating walking motion actually work reliably on an ordinary staircase, rather than simply flopping over once, unwinding limply, and coming to a stop after a single step, the way most of his earlier prototype springs almost certainly had. Betty James, born Betty Mattis in Altoona, Pennsylvania in 1918 and educated at Pennsylvania State University herself, the same institution where Richard had earned his own engineering degree a few years earlier, was given the job of naming her husband's invention once he finally had a working version ready to show the world. She later said she had never named a toy in her entire life, and that some of what first came to mind sounded genuinely terrible, awkward, or overly technical words that captured nothing of what made the thing special to watch. So she went looking through a dictionary instead, searching specifically for a word that captured the motion itself rather than the mechanism producing it, eventually landing on one that fit perfectly. Slinky, meaning sleek and sinuous in movement. With a $500 loan, a genuinely modest sum even by the standards of the mid-1940s, and hardly the kind of capital most people would consider adequate to launch a manufacturing company from scratch, the couple founded the James Spring and Wire Company, later renamed James Industries, in Clifton Heights, Pennsylvania, in 1945, the same year the Slinky went on sale to the public for the very first time. Turning a hand-tuned prototype into a mass-produced consumer product required its own separate engineering effort entirely apart from perfecting the spring's tension and wire properties in the first place, a less glamorous but equally essential piece of the puzzle. James designed and built dedicated coiling machinery specifically to take long spools of the correct steel wire and wind them, automatically and repeatedly, into the exact 98-loop configuration that had taken him 2 years of manual trial and error to work out by hand one prototype at a time, a piece of production engineering considerably less famous today than the toy itself, but every bit as necessary to turning a single clever discovery into something that could actually be manufactured by the thousands and sold at a price an ordinary family could afford without a second thought about the cost. Selling it was not easy at first. Whatever confidence the couple had in the product itself, once it actually worked reliably after 2 years of careful refinement. Toy buyers at major retailers, increasingly fascinated by a new generation of flashy battery-operated toys flooding the post-war consumer market, were resolutely uninterested in what looked, to their professionally trained eyes, like nothing more than an old beat-up spring with no lights, no batteries, no moving parts beyond the spring itself, and no obvious appeal to a modern child being raised on brighter, louder, more mechanically elaborate toys than anything a simple coil of wire could ever hope to offer in comparison. The Jameses persisted anyway, eventually securing a demonstration slot at Gimbels department store in Philadelphia, a considerably smaller opportunity than a major national retail order, but the only real foothold they could actually secure at that early stage. On November 27, 1945, they set up a small inclined platform inside the store and let the toy do the only thing it needed to do to sell itself. Walk, coil over coil, down a short series of steps in front of whatever curious shoppers happened to stop, watch, and wait to see what would happen next. They had brought 400 units with them, uncertain whether that would prove to be far too many or nowhere near enough. All 400 sold within 90 minutes, an unambiguous verdict from ordinary shoppers that ran directly counter to what professional toy buyers had confidently predicted just weeks earlier. Proof that watching the thing move in person did more selling than any pitch a buyer could have delivered secondhand. Richard James received his formal patent on the invention in 1947, describing it in the dry technical language patent law demands as a helical spring toy capable of walking from a higher point to a series of successively lower points entirely on its own. A strangely clinical description for something that had already, within the space of 90 minutes at a single department store, proven itself to be exactly the kind of simple, self-evident delight that needed no further explanation at all. The company grew steadily through the following years, expanding its product line and its manufacturing capacity as demand for the Slinky spread well beyond the Philadelphia area, where it had first found its footing at a single department store demonstration. But by the later 1950s, James Industries was, by most accounts, in genuine financial trouble, regardless of that apparent growth, edging close to bankruptcy after little more than a decade in business, a precarious position for a company whose name and product had already become recognizable in households across the entire country. Proof that visible popularity and financial stability do not always move in the same direction inside a growing manufacturing business. Then, in 1960, the company's story took a turn that had nothing at all to do with toy sales, manufacturing costs, or ordinary business pressure of any kind that an outside observer might have anticipated from the financial troubles alone. Richard and Betty James divorced that year, and Richard left the family entirely, traveling to Bolivia to become a missionary with an obscure evangelical religious group operating there, walking away from his wife, his 6 children, and the company built on his own invention, all at essentially the same moment, with no clear public explanation offered at the time for decision that struck nearly everyone who knew the family as sudden, difficult to understand, and almost impossible to reconcile with the practical, hands-on engineer they had known for decades. He would not return to the business or, in any meaningful sense, to the family he left behind. He died of a heart attack in Bolivia in 1974, having spent the last 14 years of his life almost entirely disconnected from the toy that, by then, was already carrying his name into millions of American households every single year without him. What happened next belonged almost entirely to Betty, and it is genuinely difficult to overstate how unlikely a happy outcome must have looked from where she was actually standing in 1960, with no husband, no engineering background of her own, and a company balance sheet that gave her little reason for optimism. She was left, by her own daughter's later description, a 5-foot-tall woman weighing under 100 pounds, suddenly a single mother of 6 children, in sole control of a company teetering on the very edge of collapse that she had never been formally trained to run in any capacity, with no engineering background of her own to fall back on, and no husband left to make the technical decisions he had always handled, without her direct involvement in those earlier years. Rather than closing the company down or selling it off cheaply to whoever might take it off her hands, as many people in her position might reasonably have chosen to do, given the pressure she was facing on every front at once, she took the company over herself and started making decisions Richard never had, learning the business side of a manufacturing company essentially on the job, while simultaneously raising 6 children, largely on her own, with no partner to share either burden. In 1963, with the company still sitting in a precarious financial position, she mortgaged the family's own home to fund a trip to a major toy trade show in New York, a genuinely risky personal bet, staking the roof over her children's heads on a product line that had already nearly bankrupted the business once before under different leadership. It worked. The following investment paid off well enough to stabilize the company's finances at a moment when a single bad trade show could easily have ended things for good. In 1962, around that same general period, she had also developed the toy's now famous advertising jingle, a simple, catchy tune paired with equally simple lyrics that would go on to run largely unchanged on American television for decades afterward. One of the longest, continuously used advertising jingles in the entire consumer products industry, recognizable to generations of American children who grew up hearing the exact same few bars of music years before they ever held the toy itself in their own hands or watched it walk down a staircase for the first time. In 1965, she relocated manufacturing to Hollidaysburg, in central Pennsylvania, consolidating what had been a more scattered operation into a single, more efficient location, a facility that remains connected to Slinky production in some form even today, decades after that original consolidation move was made under considerable financial pressure. Under her direction, James Industries expanded its product line well beyond the original toy, with variations like the Slinky dog, a wheeled toy dog with a coiled spring body standing in for a stretchable midsection that delighted children in a slightly different way than the original, and steadily rebuilt the company from the brink of bankruptcy she had inherited into a genuine, stable, and increasingly profitable fixture of the American toy industry, all while raising 6 children essentially on her own during exactly the same stretch of demanding years. A dual workload that would exhaust most people working with a full management team and household staff behind them, let alone one woman running both a household and a growing manufacturing company entirely by herself. The Slinky dog in particular found an entirely unexpected second life decades after its original introduction, in a way nobody at the company could have planned for or predicted. Annual sales of the toy had drifted down to only a few hundred units a year by the mid-1990s, a quiet, near-forgotten corner of the company's much larger catalog that seemed destined to fade out of production altogether within a few more years. Then it appeared as a supporting character in the 1995 animated film Toy Story, a beloved secondary figure among the film's main cast of toys come to life. The exposure was enormous and almost immediate, arriving with none of the usual lead time a company might normally get to prepare inventory and manufacturing capacity for a sudden licensing-driven surge in demand. Production climbed from roughly 12,000 units in February 1996 to 33,000 by that April and 40,000 by July. A demand spike so sudden and so sustained that James Industries filed a fresh patent on the design in 1997. Simply to keep up with a market that had, seemingly overnight, rediscovered a toy nobody had been paying much attention to for years beforehand, turning what had been a nearly discontinued product line back into one of the company's most requested items almost by accident, in a strange, distant echo of how the entire company had started in the first place, decades earlier. Betty James ran the company for 38 years after Richard's departure, an extraordinarily long single tenure for any executive anywhere in the toy industry, finally selling James Industries to Poof Products, a Michigan-based toy manufacturer, in 1998, at which point the combined operation became known as Poof Slinky, carrying both her husband's original invention and her own decades of accumulated business decisions forward together under a new corporate structure neither of them could have imagined back on that porch in Philadelphia. She died on November 20th, 2008, at 90 years old, having spent nearly 5 decades building a single accidental invention into one of the most recognized toys in American history, largely on her own, after the man whose name is still attached to the original 1947 patent had long since disappeared from the story entirely, first to Bolivia, and then, permanently, from any further involvement in the business or the family he had once been part of at all. The Slinky was formally inducted into the National Toy Hall of Fame in 2000, a recognition that arrived while Betty herself was still alive, and well enough to see it and appreciate what her decades of quiet, determined work had actually accomplished. And more than 300 million units have been sold worldwide since that first demonstration at Gimbels back in 1945, a genuinely staggering cumulative figure for a toy still manufactured today, using essentially the same coiled wire principle James stumbled onto entirely by accident, while trying to solve a completely unrelated engineering problem for the United States Navy, more than 80 years ago now. The Slinky's reach eventually went well beyond ordinary play in ways that would have been hard to predict from a demonstration platform in a Philadelphia department store back in 1945. Beyond its obvious role as a children's toy, the same simple coiled spring has been pressed into service over the decades as a physical therapy device for patients working on hand strength and coordination, as an improvised radio antenna for soldiers and amateur radio operators who discovered its coiled shape worked surprisingly well for the purpose in a pinch, and even in ordinary households everywhere, as an impromptu holder for drapery cords or a stack of mail waiting to be sorted on a kitchen counter. A testament to just how much genuine practical utility can hide inside an object designed with nothing more ambitious in mind than making children laugh, watching it tumble down a staircase on its own. It has been sold on every inhabited continent on Earth except Antarctica, an unusually complete global footprint for a toy built from little more than a length of ordinary steel wire, and a single, well-tuned amount of tension. There's a particular kind of quiet irony sitting at the center of this story that is easy to miss if you only remember the accidental invention itself and stop paying close attention once the patent has been filed and the department store demonstration has sold out completely within 90 minutes. Richard James gets the credit history usually reaches for first, and reasonably so. He was the naval engineer who noticed something extraordinary hiding inside an ordinary falling spring, spent 2 patient years refining it into something reliable enough to sell, and secured the patent that still bears his name today, decades after his own departure from the company and from the family that built it alongside him. But the actual company, the sustained decades of decisions that turned that one clever accident into a genuinely permanent fixture of American childhood, rather than a brief post-war novelty that faded within a few years the way so many fads of that particular era eventually did. The marketing, the enduring jingle, the financial risks taken at exactly the moments they mattered most, the steady, patient rebuilding of a business that had already nearly failed once under its original leadership, belonged almost entirely to the woman he left behind with 6 children and a struggling small manufacturing company in central Pennsylvania, and no formal business training of her own to draw on beyond whatever she taught herself out of sheer necessity. The toy still carries the name Slinky, a word Betty James found leafing through an ordinary dictionary, looking for something better than the awkward first attempts she later admitted to being embarrassed by. The company that made it famous, that kept it on store shelves through a near bankruptcy, a sudden and very public departure, and a strange 50-year-later resurrection through an animated film nobody at James Industries had any hand in making, was, in every meaningful sense that actually mattered after 1960, entirely hers.